Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. We're diving into the world of the Irish mob today with John Shea. He was a former mobster. And his story, it takes us right inside Bulger's crew. And it gets pretty intense.
What I find fascinating is that Shea's account almost reads like a blueprint for the Irish mob. Their rise and their fall. It's not just a personal story. It's a window into how they operated, their code, and how it all fell apart.
Okay, so let's break this down. Starting with Shea himself. He grew up in South Boston.
Yeah.
Salty, as they call it. What was it about this place that bred so many mobsters?
Well, Shea paints this picture of Salty that's almost like its own little republic, the Irish community. They had a lot of power, not always legit, of course, and the police. Their reach was limited there, so you have this environment where crime could flourish.
And Shea was pulled into that life pretty early. He started boxing when he was just 5 years old.
He did, yeah, 5 years old. And the gym wasn't just about training, It was a hangout for some serious tough guys, including, as Shea puts it, drug dealers. And the money they were flashing around, it was tempting. And that lifestyle, yeah, it pulled him in fast.
So from boxing to drug dealing, Shea, he climbed the ranks and earned the nickname Red. Everyone in the mob had a nickname, it seems.
Yeah, they did. And nicknames weren't just names, right? It was almost like some weird family crest. Shea doesn't really say how he got his, but it shows how the mob used these names to create this sense of belonging, like a shared identity, in a world that demanded secrecy.
This family, though, it had a dark side. Especially when Shea started working with Whitey Bulger and Steve Flemming. Those are the top guys. Right?
Oh, yeah. Bulger, he was the brains behind it all. He had this aura, ruthlessness. People were terrified of him. But they also respected him, his cunning, how he always stayed one step ahead of the law. Flemming. He was known for his brutality. It's kind of ironic, given his whole obsession with juicing and healthy eating.
That is an interesting contrast, yeah. How did Shea end up in Bulger's inner circle?
It all started with an introduction from Bulger's right-hand man, Kevin Weeks. And Shea was recruited for the drug trade. He talks about these trips. To Miami, sometimes flying, sometimes driving, with bags full of cash. To buy cocaine. High-stakes stuff.
Sounds risky. Did Shea ever question Bulger's authority?
Well, there was this one incident. Bulger ordered Shea to dilute the cocaine to make more money. Shea knew that this was going to affect the quality and upset their customers. He even started selling some of the pure cocaine himself on the side. Created a lot of tension.
So even within this tight-knit crew, there were power struggles. What about the previous leader, Billy Shea? What happened to him?
When the others found out about the diluted cocaine, they went straight to Bulger. Billy Shea was called back from Florida, and Bulger forced him to retire, basically pushed him out of the business. That's how John Shea took over, stepped into the leadership role.
Bulger, he definitely had a way of controlling his crew. But how did the Irish mob in Boston compare to other groups, like the Italian Mafia?
Shea's account, it highlights a key difference. The Irish mob, they were hyper-focused on business, structured, disciplined, always aiming for profit. Bulger. He was the architect of this approach. The Italian Mafia, at least from Shea's perspective, they were more flamboyant, more likely to attract attention they didn't want.
But they still collaborated sometimes, right?
Absolutely. Shea mentions how the Irish mob, they would sometimes act as muscle for the Italian Mafia, carrying out hits, doing their dirty work. It was a complex relationship, a mix of competition and cooperation, all fueled by the desire for power and money.
Shows you that organized crime isn't black and white. It's this web of alliances and rivalries. But one thing that seems to have remained constant is the code of silence, this absolute refusal to become an informant. How important was this code to the Irish mob?
Oh, the code. Especially loyalty. It was ingrained in them from a very young age. It was part of their Irish heritage, this history of resisting oppression, fighting against betrayal. She describes it as an unspoken rule, but breaking it. Deadly consequences.
Shea's loyalty. It was put to the test by Bulger himself.
It was. He was taken to a basement. Confronted by Bulger, Bulger pointed an Uzi at him, demanding information about his associates. It was a test, and Shea passed. Refused to betray anyone. Proved his loyalty. Unwavering.
That must have been terrifying. But he stood his ground, even when it meant risking his own life.
And that decision, it came back to haunt him in 1990, when he was indicted on serious charges. He could have turned informant, reduced his sentence, but he chose to stay silent, upholding the code, even though it meant years in prison.
So this code, this loyalty that held the Irish mob together, it ultimately led to their downfall.
That's what Shea's story suggests. This influx of informants, including Bulger and Flemming themselves, it shattered that trust, led to widespread arrests, convictions, effectively dismantled the whole organization from within.
It's ironic, the very thing that made them strong
Yeah.
ultimately destroyed them.
It's a classic example, right, of the contradictions you find in criminal organizations. They rely on loyalty, trust. But the nature of their business, it breeds suspicion and betrayal.
What happened to Shea after he got out of prison?
He was released in 2002. After serving 12 years, he turned his life around, became a union construction worker, and eventually he decided to write about his experiences, published 2 books, Rat Bastards and A Kid from Salty.
He took his past and turned it into something positive. He even had a run-in with Johnny Depp, who played Bulger in that film.
Oh, yeah. He was invited to the set, saw Depp in full Bulger makeup, triggered a visceral reaction in him. He was so disgusted by what Bulger had become, he had to leave the set just to compose himself.
That must have been surreal, seeing the man who betrayed him, even if it was just an actor portraying him.
Yeah, this powerful image speaks to the lasting impact of Bulger's betrayal on Shea.
Let's go back to Shea's time in the mob, though. He mentioned unofficial rules, like a code of conduct. Beyond just keeping quiet, what were they?
Bulger had specific expectations for his crew. He valued fitness, clean living, self-respect. He wanted his men to present themselves well, conduct themselves with a certain decorum, even while committing crimes.
So it wasn't just about brute force. There was this element of image control, discipline. How did the Irish mob handle territory and disputes?
They had designated areas of control. South Boston, that was Bulger's domain. Other groups, like the ones in Charlestown, had their own territories. There was a level of respect for those boundaries.
The system of mutual understanding, so to speak. Were there any major conflicts?
Shea does mention a gang war happening before his time, though. Involved the Winter Hill Gang and other factions. He says it resulted in a lot of bloodshed. Violence was always a possibility, but they generally tried to avoid all-out war. Bad for business.
What about weapons? How did they get them?
Shea admits to having a large collection of guns. A lot of them were stolen. He describes this network, individuals who would rob gun stores and supply the mob with weapons, handguns, machine pistols, rifles, even a police-issue shotgun. They had it all.
So they were heavily armed, prepared for anything. Did Shea ever have to resort to violence to collect debts or enforce his authority?
He does. He recounts this particularly brutal incident involving a customer who owed him $10,000. Shea staked out the man's house, waited for him, and then attacked him with a baseball bat, left him bloodied in the gutter. Message was clear. Don't mess with John Shea.
It's a disturbing story.
Yeah.
But it illustrates the brutality of that world. Shea seems to acknowledge that violence was sometimes necessary, but he also expresses regret. It's complex.
It is. It reveals this internal struggle within Shea. He was a product of a violent environment. He participated in that violence, but he also seems to be wrestling with the moral implications of his actions.
But let's shift gears for a moment. Shea witnessed payments to law enforcement. What can you tell us about the corruption that was rampant back then?
Shea claims to have seen firsthand payments being made to law enforcement officers. It wasn't unusual, a few $1,000s, to smooth over problems, ensure protection. He even suggests this corruption went beyond the police department, reached into the FBI.
That's a serious accusation. Did he name any specific individuals?
He does. He mentions John Connolly and John Morris, both FBI agents, as being involved in shady dealings with Bulger and Flemming. Connolly was Bulger's main contact within the FBI, providing information, protection, in exchange for favors.
So Bulger was manipulating the very system that was meant to bring him down. It's remarkable. His cunning.
It shows how deeply embedded Bulger was in the system. It was crucial to Bulger's long reign of terror. He evaded justice for years, thanks to corrupt officials.
This level of corruption, it raises questions about how much of this was happening behind the scenes. It's a dark chapter in law enforcement history.
Without a doubt. The extent of the corruption, it's still being uncovered. It's a reminder that power, even in the hands of those sworn to uphold the law, it's vulnerable to abuse.
And this corruption, it backfired on Bulger. When Connolly and Morris were exposed, he had to go on the run. It took 16 years before they finally caught him in Santa Monica in 2011.
And you know what they found? When they caught him, they found a copy of Shea's book among Bulger's possessions.
Wow, that's quite a twist.
Bulger, the man who prided himself on intelligence and control, he was ultimately undone by the very people he manipulated.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal, We've only scratched the surface of Shea's account of the Irish mob.
What makes it so compelling is that we're hearing it from someone who lived it, someone who experienced the camaraderie and the brutality firsthand. John Shea's story. It reveals that the line between good and evil, it can be blurry, and even hardened criminals, they can change.
His story demonstrates the human capacity for both darkness and redemption.
You know, it's interesting. Shea's account, it kind of debunks this romanticized image of the Irish mob that you see in movies and stories. He doesn't shy away from the violence they inflicted.
It's easy to get caught up in that whole Robin Hood thing, right? With guys like Bulger. But Shea's story, it's a reality check.
He describes collecting debts with a baseball bat, talks about how casually they accepted murder to get rid of rivals or silence potential informants. These guys weren't folk heroes. They were criminals who thrived on fear and intimidation.
Shea even admits, that he was initially attracted to the money and the power, or at least the perception of power. That came with being part of that world.
Right. The lure of easy money and influence. It's powerful, especially in a place like South Boston. But Shea's story, it also shows the price you pay for that lifestyle. He spent years in prison, and even after getting out, he's still dealing with the consequences of his actions.
Writing and sharing his story, though, it seems like it's been a path to healing for him, maybe even a form of redemption.
There's a sense of honesty in his writing. He's not glorifying his past, but he's not running from it either. Owning his mistakes, offering a raw, unfiltered look at this world that's usually so secretive.
Takes guts to do that, to lay it all out there. Risk being judged.
And by doing so, he's giving us these valuable insights into the human side of organized crime, forcing us to confront the complexities of people caught up in these illegal activities and the consequences.
One thing that really struck me was Shea's description of how the Irish mob in Boston operated differently from other organized crime outfits, like the Italian mafia.
Right. He emphasizes their business focus, their organizational structure, discipline. They were incredibly effective at maintaining control and avoiding those huge gang wars that you saw in other cities.
Bulger's intelligence
Yeah.
and strategic thinking, they were key factors in their success.
Absolutely. He understood how to manipulate the system, cultivate those relationships with powerful people, use violence strategically to consolidate his power. And then there were those revelations about his ties to the FBI.
It's mind-boggling to think that someone could operate outside the law for so long while also being connected to law enforcement.
It shows you how insidious corruption can be, the lengths that people will go to protect themselves, even if it means betraying the public trust.
Shea's story also mentions how technology is changing the game. Cybercrime, it's becoming so prevalent.
He believes that the old way of doing things, the neighborhood-based model of organized crime, it's fading away. The world's too interconnected now, too transparent, for those groups to operate the way they used to.
It makes you wonder how the Irish mob and organized crime in general will adapt to all this change.
Right. Will they embrace the new technologies, find new vulnerabilities to exploit? These are questions that law enforcement is dealing with all over the world.
Shea's firsthand experience with the Irish mob, it's a unique perspective on the past and present of organized crime.
His story is both a cautionary tale and a story of resilience. He broke free from a life of crime, forged a new path for himself.
And he's using his platform to share his story, giving us this rare glimpse into a world most people never see.
It speaks to his character. He's not afraid to confront his past, the good and the bad, and learn from it.
Shea's decision to stay loyal to the code, even when he was facing those serious charges, it shows how deeply embedded it was in the Irish mob's culture.
Yeah. Betrayal was the ultimate sin. Even though that loyalty ultimately contributed to their downfall, it clearly played a huge role in their actions, their decisions.
It has another layer to Shea's story, right? He was caught between these two worlds, trying to make sense of his past and his present.
It's a testament to how complex we are as humans, the challenges we face. When you're trying to navigate a world where loyalty and betrayal are so closely linked.
His story definitely makes you think on a lot of different levels.
It does. It raises questions about what loyalty really means, the price of power, the pull of the criminal world.
We could spend hours talking about all the different angles of Shea's story.
It's a fascinating look into the world of the Irish mob.
Shea's story, it really intertwines with the whole history of the Irish mob in Boston, doesn't it? I mean, he was there for it all. Their rise, their peak, and then how they all came crashing down.
Yeah, it's true. His account really does read like a first-hand look at a turning point in organized crime. He wasn't just watching it happen, he was part of it. shaping events by the choices he made and the things he did.
And what I find so striking is how willing he is to share all of it. You know, pulling back the curtain on a world that's always been so secretive.
Definitely. It really does say a lot about who he is as a person. He's not afraid to look back at his past. All of it, the good and the bad. And take something from it, learn from it.
That takes a lot of courage, I think, especially considering what he did, putting himself out there, knowing that people might judge him.
Yeah, you're right. His story is a good reminder that even those who've done terrible things, they can grow, they can change for the better.
Shea's journey is pretty inspiring, I have to say. From being an enforcer to becoming an author, he proves that it's never too late to change your life, to make a real difference.
And his story, it's so valuable for anyone who wants to understand organized crime, its history, how it's evolving. He offers a perspective that you just won't get from textbooks or news articles.
His insights, they come from his own experiences, his deep knowledge of the Irish mob. They're so important for anyone who wants to get a look inside.
And because he's willing to share his story, we can explore those motivations, what leads people to crime, and how to break free from it all.
We've gone through a lot today. We've traced John Shea's path from when he was a kid in South Boston to his time in Bulger's crew and his eventual transformation into an author.
It's quite the story, full of crime, loyalty, betrayal, and in the end, redemption.
It really makes you rethink what you thought you knew about organized crime. And it makes you realize that even the people we might consider hardened criminals, they have the potential to change.
Yeah. And the fact that Shea is so open about his past, everything he went through, it says a lot about him and his desire to shed some light on a world that most people don't understand.
It's a reminder that the line between good and bad isn't always so clear-cut. And even those who've done terrible things, they deserve some empathy, some understanding.
Absolutely. And maybe by hearing stories like his, we can understand what drives people to crime and figure out how to stop future generations from going down the same path.
Well, that's an interesting case for Simon and Tom to talk about in their weekly review on Sunday. But in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.